Now to the debate in Texas. At stake, what information to keep in and to take out of public school textbooks. There are opinions on both sides of the issue, and the controversy is being heard all across the nation. More importantly, how will the decisions today make an impact on what our children learn tomorrow? Fox's Brenda Blackman has more.
You've got really a small group of left-wing liberals.
There's too much ideology and not enough education.
I'm concerned about the efforts to simplify, sanitize, and sanctify.
It's a burning controversy in Texas, one that has ramifications from coast to coast.
This is not a good way to make sound education policy.
The issue now before the Texas Board of Education: proposed changes in textbooks for every school in the state. Liberals, for example, want to eliminate Christmas, Independence Day, and General George Patton. Conservatives pushing a religious line, such as teaching that George Washington was saved from death in battle by divine intervention, or replacing Susan B. Anthony and Shirley Chisholm with Phyllis Schlafly. Mark Stern is a First Amendment expert.
The key fight is whether the people who wrote the Constitution, and earlier the people who came to this country, had in mind creating a Christian country in some way, or whether they intended to create what we would today call a pluralistic democracy where religion didn't determine the politics of the country.
So you ask, why do I care about the textbooks that Texas buys? The answer: the textbooks that Texas buys might end up in your community schools.
Texas purchases a huge number of textbooks. It's a very big state. It's such a big market that textbook publishers all over the country try and make their textbooks acceptable to Texas. Most other states in the country are going to find their choices affected by what Texas does.
The Texas Board of Education is scheduled to make its decision in May, and whatever the vote, the textbook controversy could end up in court for years. Brenda Blackman, Fox News.
And just last week, the Texas State Board of Education voted 10-5 in a preliminary vote to insert conservative ideals into social studies. Joining me now is Deneen Borelli, who is a fellow with Project 21, and William Gaudelli, who is an associate professor of social studies and education at the Teachers College, Columbia University. Good morning to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. On the surface, Deneen, this just seems like a political battle more than educational issues.
Well, this is a sign to me that the American people are taking our country back. And if you look at all the activity that's going on with the Tea Party movement and Americans who are frustrated with big government, the spending, the bailout, the debt, now parents and the board in Texas here is focused on education because they're tired of the progressive agenda taking control of our schools. It's wrong.
So then, William, here, it seems when you hear that, according to the story, that the liberals want to take out Christmas and Independence Day, and conservatives want to replace key figures in history. They both seem a little bit outlandish. There's no way to meet in the middle?
Well, there is a way to meet in the middle, but the way to do it is around historical accuracy rather than political ideology. And so in response to what Deneen was saying, the notion that it's been a progressive curriculum all along is really nonsense to begin with. And that's the premise that the Texas School Board began with. Fundamentally, it's not. It's a very middle-of-the-road curriculum that they had, and they were attempting to tweak it. But what they're doing now is clearly attempting to rewrite it in historical revisionism from the right that doesn't serve anyone's purposes and really will miseducate kids about the history of the republic.
William, with as far as curriculum is concerned, obviously districts have, for people who are in charge of that, and states as well. Can we get to a point where the state, each state by state, will then handle its own curriculum and say, we're going to do our own curriculum, we will create what we want these kids to learn in our schools, and not worry about what other states are doing? Do we do that now, or is it just too much, carte blanche for the entire country?
That's in effect how it happens. Education is fundamentally a local issue and it's a state issue. But given that, the textbook selection and the writing of textbooks is very much dominated by Texas, and that's why we ought to be concerned about it. And the nature of this conversation, that they are excluding people like Eugene Debs, Helen Keller, Susan B. Anthony, Betty Friedan. I mean, it's unbelievable, unthinkable to me that these people who are such important contributors contributors to the Republic's development are being left out systematically for a political bias serving a board in Texas.
And here's the concern. It should be a balanced discussion, and it should be balanced information in the textbooks. It should not be one-sided, because that's biased.
But if I'm
that is brainwashing children. We should be teaching our children to think. This should be not a one-sided effort when it comes to education.
If I can respond to that, though, the notion that there's a sort of relativism in this is very alarming to me. For example, in the curriculum that's now being authored, they suggest that George Wallace ought to be put on the same playing field as Martin Luther King. To my way of thinking, they are not moral equivalents. George Wallace was a segregationist and a racist. Martin Luther King fought for the egalitarian rights of all people.
Yes, but
to my way of thinking, they ought to not be on the same level playing field.
They're historically important people. You might argue Martin Luther King Jr. was played a more of an important role, but they're historically, factually important people.
Of course.
It's important to have the facts, and you can't deny history. So you have situations where they don't want certain aspects of history in the textbooks. And the other fact is that it should be, like I said before, it should be balanced. If you have a controversial issue, you should have both sides of the spectrum here.
Is there a bias in New York's textbooks in what these kids are learning?
Well, I think a big problem is that they keep throwing more and more money at a problem that should be really start in the home, because more and more parents should be involved in their children's education. This is what we're witnessing now, where parents are getting involved. They're being a lot more vocal.
It must be tough to come up with what goes in textbooks, because there's just so much. You
Sure.
can't fit it all in, William.
Everything has a point of view, and that's very clear. But what's also clear here is that there's a political agenda that's driving this change. So they want to take the civil rights movement, which I thought we had a great consensus about in our society was a good thing, and suggest that, well, maybe it wasn't such a good thing. Maybe we ought to revisit that. I don't think that's really a morally defensible position, nor a historically accurate position
Well,
to
here's
take.
another example. There's an instance where they want to remove the fact that you have, totally lost my train of thought. They want to remove the Great Society aspect. And in this instance right now, it's looking like they're going to put it back in. Well, what did the Great Society do to families? What did they do to black families with welfare, for example? There was no incentive for people to work, no incentive for people to even try to look for a job. And they removed the father from the head of the household. And this is a problem that we're facing still today. You have a ton of single parent households
The curriculum
where
is
children are
also-
just raising themselves.
The curriculum, though, is also looking to remove Herbert Hoover and a comparison between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the fault here is that Hoover's policies for 3 years drove the country into the Great Depression, and Roosevelt's policies are what turned the country around. And that sort of omission, I think, is a terrible omission, particularly in light of the economic crisis that we're in now.
Which is why we should keep both sides of the issue in the books.
I'm saying we're debating it now, and they'll be debating, I'm sure, for years to come, obviously, what's going on. William and Deneen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We do appreciate great insight and great input. Thank you so much. I know there are much more about